The distress signal was barely a whisper, a wobbly, inconsistent blip against the backdrop of white noise. Lawson leaned forward in his chair, his fingers hovering over the controls of his lab's aging receiver. "That's not static," he muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes at the display. The signal came and went, erratic and weak, but unmistakably artificial. It didn't belong there, not in this expanse of empty space he'd been scanning for weeks. Derek was an astrophysicist by trade, though his career had drifted into obscurity after he'd left academia years ago. Now he spent his days in a cluttered lab funded by a shoestring budget, tinkering with outdated equipment and chasing anomalies most people would brush off. But this was something. The signal was coming from a moon orbiting a gas giant nearly 20 light-years away. It was barren, uninhabitable, and utterly unremarkable until now. He spent hours isolating the signal, confirming it wasn't interference or a glitch. When he was sure it was real, Derek grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. He didn't have the resources for a mission, but he knew who might. 3 weeks later, Derek found himself cramped inside an old exploration vessel, the kind of ship that looked like it belonged in a museum more than deep space. The private exploration company he'd petitioned wasn't exactly NASA, but they'd agreed to fund his trip after he'd pitched the discovery as a potential alien artifact, or at least something marketable. The journey was long and uncomfortable, with the ship's dim lighting flickering every time he adjusted course. He spent most of it going over his notes, triple-checking calculations, and trying to ignore the rattling sound from the engine that definitely wasn't in the pre-flight checklist. When the moon finally came into view, Derek's stomach knotted with both excitement and dread. Its surface was jagged and hostile, with cliffs that looked like they'd been torn apart by some ancient, violent event. Geysers of gas erupted sporadically, spitting sulfuric clouds into the thin atmosphere. He lowered the craft onto the most stable patch of ground he could find, his hands gripping the controls tightly as the landing gear groaned in protest. The signal was stronger here, guiding him to a rocky outcrop near the edge of a deep crater. Derek suited up, grabbed a portable scanner and stepped out onto the moon's surface. The air was unbreathable, and the ground crunched beneath his boots like shattered glass. It didn't take long to find the source of the signal, a metallic pod half buried in the ground, its surface scorched and dented as if it had crash-landed long ago. As he approached, a faint growl made him freeze. Inside the pod was a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. It resembled a wolf in its general shape: 4 legs, a long snout, and pointed ears, but its features were alien, with fur that shimmered faintly under his helmet light and eyes that glowed faintly green. It was too small to be fully grown, its frame frail and hunched. Patches of fur were missing, revealing raw, discolored skin underneath. The creature bared its teeth weakly, but the sound it made was more pitiful than threatening. When Derek took a cautious step closer, the creature tried to rise but crumpled onto its side, its breathing shallow and labored. "Looks like you're in worse shape than my ship," Derek said aloud, his voice muffled by his helmet. "Let's see if we can fix that." Against every instinct screaming at him to leave it alone, he pried open the pod's hatch. The interior was cluttered with wires and blinking lights, most of which had been smashed beyond recognition. He spotted a device embedded in the creature's neck, sparking faintly. It looked like some kind of translator, though it was clearly malfunctioning. Derek hesitated before toggling a switch on its side. A distorted, broken voice crackled to life. "RR ejected. Unfit, cast out." The words were halting and garbled, but they sent a chill down Derek's spine. He glanced at the creature, which didn't seem to have the strength to register his presence anymore. "Well, that's not ominous," he muttered, scooping the creature into his arms despite its weak protests. It was lighter than he expected, almost worryingly so. Back aboard the ship, Derek laid the creature on a makeshift bed in the cargo hold. The ship's medical supplies were laughably outdated, but he did what he could, cleaning its wounds and patching up the worst of the damage. It flinched at his touch, growling weakly, but it didn't have the energy to fight him off. The translator sputtered again as he worked. "No, place, too weak, not survive," Derek frowned. "Hey, you're still breathing, aren't you? That's a start." He wasn't sure if it could understand him, but talking felt less isolating than the silence of the ship. "I've been called unfit a couple of times myself, if it makes you feel any better. People said I'd never make anything of myself." "Guess we've got something in common." The creature's glowing eyes flicked toward him briefly before closing again. It was hard to tell whether it was calming down or simply too exhausted to care. Derek spent hours monitoring its condition, cycling between tending to it and running diagnostics on the translator. The more he examined the device, the clearer it became that it wasn't just a translator, it was part of a larger system that seemed to regulate the creature's vital signs. Whatever species had designed it, they'd built it to keep the creature alive under harsh conditions. But now it was failing, and fast. By the time the moon was fading into the distance behind them, Derek had managed to stabilize the device enough to keep the creature alive. It still refused food, but its breathing had steadied, and its eyes followed him more alertly when he moved around the cabin. "You're stronger than you look, you know," Derek said one evening, leaning back in his chair. "Don't let anybody tell you different." The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. It still didn't speak, but the translator occasionally flickered with garbled static that almost sounded like it was trying to respond. Derek didn't know what the future held for his strange passenger, but for now it was alive. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The creature stirred for the first time in hours, a low, rattling sound escaping its throat. Derek had been tinkering with the ship's ancient navigation console, trying to coax it into running a more efficient course toward a nearby outpost, but the noise made him turn. The creature's eyes, those unsettling, faintly glowing green orbs, were wide open now, locked on him with a clarity that was almost unnerving. "You're awake," Derek said, setting down his tools and moving closer. The creature tensed as he approached, its thin body trembling under the thermal blanket he'd thrown over it. The translator on its neck flickered, static crackling faintly before a distorted voice emerged. "You took me." Derek crouched down, keeping a deliberate distance as he gave a small shrug. "Didn't seem like you were doing too well back there. Figured you'd rather wake up on a ship than, a crater." The creature's chest rose and fell unevenly, its breathing shallow. The translator spat out another disjointed string of words. "Weak, should not, you should leave." Derek frowned but kept his tone light. "Wow, you're welcome, by the way." "Always nice to be appreciated." The creature blinked slowly, as if studying him with the same care a predator might use to size up its prey. Finally, it shifted, trying to lift itself into a sitting position. Its limbs trembled violently from the effort, and it collapsed back with a pained grunt. "Hey, easy," Derek said, instinctively reaching out before pulling back when the creature flinched. "You're not exactly at full strength." "Maybe take it slow." The translator buzzed again, its words sharp and bitter. "Strength, I have none, I am nothing." Derek exhaled, leaning back on his heels. "Well, that's a little dramatic, don't you think? You're still kicking." "That's gotta count for something." The creature's glowing eyes narrowed, its gaze flicking over him as if trying to decipher his motives. Its voice, distorted as it was, carried an edge of deep bitterness. "You would not survive among Zarlith, too soft, too kind," Derek snorted, "and yet here we are." Guess being soft has its perks. The creature's expression didn't change, but Derek thought he saw a flicker of something: confusion, maybe, curiosity. It was hard to tell. He grabbed a nearby stool and sat down, putting himself at eye level with it. "So," he said, "you've got a name, or do I just keep calling you Glowy Wolf Guy?" The creature hesitated, its jaw tightening. Then finally the translator buzzed out a single word: "Rezik." "Rezik," Derek repeated, nodding. "Nice to meet you, I'm Derek." The creature Rezik didn't respond. It turned its head slightly, its glowing eyes dimming as if the effort of the conversation had already drained it. But just as Derek thought it might have fallen back into unconsciousness, the translator buzzed again. "I was Runt," it said haltingly. "Too small, too weak, my kind. Do not keep those who cannot hunt, cannot fight." Derek leaned forward slightly, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean, don't keep? They just..." "What throw you out?" Rezik's breathing hitched, and the translator struggled to keep up with the emotion in its voice. "Expendable, pod, ejected pack leader, chose my life." "Was waste." Derek stared at it, his stomach twisting. The idea of being cast out like that, abandoned by your own kind for something you couldn't control, it hit a nerve he hadn't expected. He thought about high school, about the way his teachers had looked at him after he'd bombed his first big science fair, about the way his colleagues had dismissed him when his research veered into uncharted territory. It wasn't the same, not by a long shot, but he recognized something familiar in Rezik's voice. "Well, your pack leader sounds like a real jerk," Derek said finally, his tone lighter than he felt. "But hey, their loss, right? You're still here, that's gotta count for something." Rezik didn't respond, but it didn't turn away either. Derek took that as a small victory. Over the next few days, their interactions were limited but slowly growing. Rezik still flinched at Derek's movements, still looked at him with skepticism whenever he tried to help, but it no longer growled when he approached. Progress, however slight, was progress. Derek spent most of his time juggling repairs on the ship and trying to coax Rezik into eating something. The ship's food supply wasn't exactly gourmet, mostly freeze-dried meals and nutrient packs, but he figured it was better than nothing. Rezik, however, seemed to disagree, sniffing at the food with clear disdain before turning its head away. "You're gonna waste away if you don't eat something," Derek said one evening, holding up a nutrient bar like it was a prize. "Come on, it's not that bad. Tastes like cardboard, sure, but it's the good kind of cardboard." Rezik let out a low growl, but it didn't have the same edge as before. The translator buzzed faintly. "Do not." "Pity me," Derek blinked. "Pity you, nah. I'm just trying to keep you alive so you can tell your pack leader to shove it when you're back on your feet." Rezik tilted its head slightly, the faintest glimmer of confusion in its glowing eyes. "You are strange," it said finally. "Your kind, strange," Derek grinned, leaning back against the wall. "Yeah, we get that a lot. Humans are kinda known for being weird. But hey, weird's not so bad." For the first time, Rezik didn't respond with hostility or dismissal. It simply watched him, its expression unreadable. Derek took that as another small victory. As the days passed, Rezik began to speak more about its species, the Zarlith. Apex predators, it called them, rulers of their planet's ecosystems. Strength and survival were the only things that mattered to them. Weakness, in any form, was a death sentence. "They sound exhausting," Derek said one evening after Rezik had described the brutal hierarchy of its kind. "I mean, who decides what's weak anyway?" Sounds pretty arbitrary. Rezik's gaze was distant, its voice softer than usual. Pack leader, always the largest, the strongest, they decide. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Well, for what it's worth, I think your pack leader's an idiot. Strength isn't just about muscles or whatever. Sometimes it's about, I don't know, holding on when everybody else would have given up. Rezik didn't respond, but Derek thought he saw the faintest flicker of something in its eyes. Hope, maybe. It was hard to tell. The ship continued its slow journey through the vastness of space, its patched-together systems groaning under the strain. Derek spent his nights in the cockpit, staring out at the endless stars and wondering what the hell he was going to do with his strange, reluctant passenger. But every time he thought about dropping Rezik off at the next outpost and letting someone else deal with it, he remembered the way it had looked at him in the cargo hold, its glowing eyes full of bruised pride and barely hidden fear. No, Derek thought, he wasn't going to abandon Rezik. Not now. Not ever. Derek's fingers danced across the console with calm precision, but his pulse hammered in his ears. The Zarlith ship's signal had appeared on his scanner without warning, a sleek and ominous blip gliding toward them at an unsettling speed. He didn't need to be an expert in Zarlith technology to know that ship spelled trouble. Rezik, Derek called over his shoulder, keeping one eye on the scanner as he adjusted their trajectory. You might want to take a look at this. Rezik, who had been curled up in the corner of the cockpit for the past hour, lifted its head sluggishly. It still looked frail, its ribs faintly visible beneath its shimmering fur, but its eyes were sharper now, more alert. It dragged itself upright and padded toward the console, its glowing gaze narrowing as it caught sight of the incoming signal. The translator crackled. Zarlith vessel. Searching. Derek didn't like the tension in Rezik's voice. Searching for what? Rezik's ears flattened against its skull, and for the first time Derek saw something close to panic flash across its features. For me, they hunt defectives, weaklings. Must eliminate erase from pack memory. Derek swore under his breath, his fingers tightening on the controls. Okay, that's super messed up, but they're not getting you. Not on my watch. Rezik stared at him, its expression a mix of disbelief and something else, something Derek couldn't quite name. You would fight for me? It asked quietly. Derek glanced at the radar, the Zarlith ship drawing closer with every passing second. Fight, no. But I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. Without waiting for Rezik's response, Derek adjusted their course, steering the ship toward the nearest asteroid field. The cluster of rocks was massive, a chaotic tangle of debris orbiting a distant gas giant. It wasn't exactly an ideal hiding spot, but it was the best shot they had. Hold on, Derek muttered, gripping the controls tightly as the ship plunged into the asteroid field. The view outside the cockpit became a swirling blur of jagged rocks, some of them the size of mountains, others small enough to ricochet off the hull without doing much damage. The ship's systems groaned in protest as Derek weaved through the chaos, narrowly avoiding a collision at every turn. Rezik steadied itself against the console, its claws scraping faintly against the metal. This is madness, it growled, though the translator's distortions softened the bite of its words. You cannot outmaneuver them. Maybe not, Derek admitted, his tone annoyingly chipper, but I can make it really annoying for them to catch us. The Zarlith ship had followed them into the asteroid field, its sleek silhouette darting nimbly between the tumbling rocks. It was faster, more advanced, and definitely better equipped for this kind of environment. But Derek had one advantage. He'd spent most of his career tinkering with outdated tech, learning how to make the most out of equipment that shouldn't have worked at all. If there was one thing he knew how to do, it was improvise. He guided the ship toward the shadow of a particularly massive asteroid, its uneven surface creating pockets of darkness that the Zarlith sensors would struggle to penetrate. The ship's aging thrusters sputtered in protest as he adjusted their speed, using the asteroid's gravitational pull to mask their movements. Rezik's eyes darted between the radar and the viewport, its breathing shallow. "They will find us." Hey, Derek interrupted, shooting it a quick glance. "Do me a favor and breathe, okay?" Panicking's not gonna help. Rezik's ears twitched, but it didn't argue. Instead, it closed its eyes for a moment, drawing in a shaky breath. When it opened them again, it seemed more focused, its gaze sharper. "I can hear them," it said suddenly, its voice low. "Their engines, 8 cycles per second." "They are to the left, close." Derek raised an eyebrow. "You can hear them through all this." "Seriously?" Rezik didn't respond, but its ears swiveled slightly, tracking something Derek couldn't perceive. He leaned forward, scanning the radar again. Sure enough, the Zarlith ship's signal had shifted, moving toward their left flank. "Okay, that's freaky, but also kind of amazing," Derek admitted, adjusting their course to slip deeper into the asteroid field. "You keep listening. Let me know if they get too close." For the next few minutes, they worked together in tense silence. Rezik's sharp senses guided Derek through the labyrinth of rocks, its faintly glowing eyes narrowing in concentration. Derek, for his part, focused on keeping the ship in one piece, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The Zarlith ship's movements became more erratic as it struggled to track them through the asteroid field. Derek allowed himself a small, triumphant grin as he guided their ship into the shadow of another massive rock, its surface pockmarked with craters. "They're losing us," he said, glancing at Rezik. "See, told you we'd be fine." Rezik didn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, its ears twitching. When it finally spoke, its voice was softer, almost hesitant. "You're kind. Strange, you do not flee for yourself, you hide. For me." Derek shrugged, his grin fading into something more genuine. "Well, yeah, isn't that what people do? Help each other out." Rezik's gaze lingered on him, its expression unreadable. After a moment, it turned its attention back to the viewport, its ears still tracking the faint hum of the Zarlith ship's engines. "They are retreating," it said finally, its voice tinged with cautious relief. For now, Derek exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like hours. "Good. Let's keep it that way." He guided the ship out of the asteroid field as carefully as he'd entered it, the chaotic maze of rocks gradually giving way to the vast emptiness of open space. The Zarlith ship's signal had vanished from the radar, but Derek knew better than to let his guard down completely. As the tension in the cockpit eased, Rezik settled back onto the floor, its body visibly relaxing. It still looked frail, its movements sluggish, but there was a faint glimmer of something new in its eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or trust. Derek wasn't sure, but he wasn't about to question it. "You are not weak," Rezik said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Your kind would not survive among Zarlith, but you would fight." Derek blinked, caught off guard by the comment. He chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Thanks, I guess. Though I'm not sure I'd last 5 minutes against one of your pack leaders." Rezik tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Strength is not only size," it said, its voice quieter now. "You have persistence, ingenuity, that is strength." Derek felt his cheeks flush slightly, though he wasn't sure why. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to play it off. "Well, don't go getting all sentimental on me, Rezik. I'm just trying to do the right thing." Rezik didn't respond, but its gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before it finally closed its eyes, its breathing steadying as it drifted into an uneasy sleep. Derek watched it for a while, his thoughts racing. He'd expected the Zarlith to be ruthless, sure, but hearing about the brutal hierarchy Rezik had endured was something else entirely. The idea of strength, of survival, it was so different for them. And yet, here was Rezik, small and battered but still alive, still fighting in its own way. Maybe they weren't so different after all. The Zarlith ship was gone, its signal fading into the void, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the hum of its engines ever had. The faint vibration of Derek's ship was the only sound now, a subtle reminder of their fragile existence in the infinite expanse. He adjusted the autopilot and turned his chair to face Rezik, who was lying in the corner of the cockpit, staring at nothing. "All right," Derek began, breaking the quiet. "We survived that little encounter. Now what?" Rezik's head shifted slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing as it turned to look at him. The translator buzzed faintly but didn't produce any words. Instead, Rezik's ears flattened, and it exhaled a low, weary sound that might have been a sigh. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look, I get it. You've been through a lot and your whole pack basically wrote you off, but you're still here. You've got a shot at something better. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" Rezik's gaze hardened, though there was a flicker of something vulnerable beneath the surface. "Do," it growled, the translator struggling to keep up with the raw edge in its voice. "What purpose does the weak have? I am nothing. I was cast out." Derek shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "See, that's the thing. You're not nothing, you're alive. You've got a brain, a heartbeat, and one hell of a set of ears, apparently. That's more than a lot of beings can say." Rezik didn't respond immediately. Its eyes dimmed slightly, and its shoulders slumped as if the weight of Derek's words was too much to bear. But then, after a long moment, it spoke again, its voice quieter now. "You risked your survival for me," it said haltingly. "Why?" Derek considered the question for a moment before giving a small shrug. "Because that's what we do. Humans, I mean, we look out for each other, even when it's risky. Even when it doesn't make sense." Rezik tilted its head, its ears twitching faintly. "For the weak, always," Derek said firmly. "That's what makes us human." The translator buzzed faintly, struggling to process Rezik's response. It lowered its gaze, its claws scraping lightly against the floor. "I do not understand," it admitted, its voice barely audible. "Zarlith do not protect the weak. The weak are a burden." "Well, that explains why your pack leader's such a jerk," Derek said with a wry grin. "But here's the thing, strength isn't just about brute force. It's about making a difference, about helping others even when it's hard, and you've got that kind of strength, Rezik. You just don't see it yet." Rezik blinked slowly, its glowing eyes searching Derek's face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "You believe this?" it asked quietly. "Yeah," Derek said without hesitation. "I do." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the ship filled the silence, a steady, unchanging rhythm that seemed to ground them both. Finally, Rezik lifted its head, its ears perking up slightly. "I do not wish to live by Zarlith standards," it said, its voice steadier now. "I do not wish to be bound by them." Derek felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "That's a start. So what do you want instead?" Rezik hesitated, its gaze drifting toward the viewport. The endless expanse of stars seemed to hold its attention, their distant light reflecting faintly in its eyes. When it finally spoke, its voice was filled with quiet determination. "I want to find my own path," it said, "to live. Not as they dictated, but as I choose." That, Derek said, leaning back with a satisfied nod, is probably the best idea you've had yet. Rezik glanced at him, its expression softening ever so slightly. You would help, of course, Derek said without missing a beat. But we're gonna need a plan. Any ideas? Rezik tilted its head, its ears twitching thoughtfully. After a moment it said, I sense. A planet nearby, green. Lush, it is distant, but I can hear it, feel it. Derek raised an eyebrow. A habitable planet, you're sure? I am sure, Rezik said firmly. It is different. But it is alive. Derek rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Well, I guess it's worth checking out. If it's what you need to start fresh, let's find it. He turned his attention to the navigation console, inputting new coordinates based on Rezik's description. The ship's computer groaned in protest, but eventually complied, recalibrating their course toward the distant planet. As the ship altered its trajectory, Rezik settled back onto the floor, its movements slow but more deliberate than before. There was a quiet strength in its posture now, a determination that hadn't been there before. You know, Derek said as he adjusted the ship's speed, you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. A lot stronger. Rezik's ears twitched, and it glanced at him with a faintly skeptical expression. You are strange, it said, though there was no malice in its voice. Yeah, well, you're not exactly normal yourself, Derek shot back with a grin. But hey, who wants to be normal anyway? Rezik didn't respond, but Derek thought he saw the faintest flicker of amusement in its glowing eyes. The journey to the planet was long and uneventful, the monotony broken only by occasional conversations and the distant hum of the ship's engines. Derek spent most of his time tinkering with the ship's systems, while Rezik alternated between resting and observing him with quiet curiosity. When they finally entered the planet's orbit, Derek couldn't help but let out a low whistle. The view from the cockpit was breathtaking, a vibrant green world covered in sprawling forests, winding rivers, and towering mountains. It was a sharp contrast to the barren, hostile moons and asteroids they'd encountered on their journey. Well, Derek said, leaning back in his chair, if this place doesn't scream fresh start, I don't know what does. Rezik's gaze was fixed on the planet, its glowing eyes wide with wonder. It didn't say anything, but Derek could see the tension in its posture, the way its claws dug slightly into the floor as if bracing itself for something. You ready? Derek asked gently. Rezik glanced at him, its expression unreadable. After a moment, it gave a small nod. Yes. Derek guided the ship into the planet's atmosphere, the turbulence shaking the cabin as they descended. The surface came into view quickly, the dense forests and sparkling rivers growing larger with every passing second. He found a clearing near the edge of a forest and brought the ship down carefully, the landing gear sinking slightly into the soft earth. As the engines powered down, Derek turned to Rezik. This is it, he said, your new home. Rezik hesitated for a moment before rising to its feet. It moved slowly, deliberately, its glowing eyes scanning the cockpit as if committing every detail to memory. When it finally stepped toward the airlock, Derek followed, watching as it paused at the threshold. The planet's air was fresh and cool, carrying the faint scent of vegetation and earth. Rezik stepped out cautiously, its paws sinking into the soft ground. It stood there for a long moment, its ears twitching as it took in the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. Derek stayed back, giving it space. He watched as Rezik lifted its head, its posture straighter and more confident than he'd ever seen. It took a few tentative steps forward, then turned back to look at him. Thank you, it said simply, its voice clear and steady. Derek smiled, leaning against the airlock. Anytime? He stayed there as Rezik ventured deeper into the forest, its shimmering fur blending with the dappled sunlight. For the first time, it didn't look small or fragile. It looked free.